Americans often take America's success for granted, so hear it from me as an outsider. There is no country quite like America. Why is this? Is it perhaps because the laws of physics are different in America? No, they're not. The laws of physics are the same in America as everywhere else on the planet. Is it perhaps because there's something in the water in America? Well, I can tell you, coming from Jackson, there's certainly something in the water that that's a different story. No, the real reason why your country is different is because of decisions that were made in that old courthouse in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. That is what injected liberty into the DNA of your republic. That is what sets America apart. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm not from around here. That's right, I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. But before moving to Jackson, I had the grave misfortune to not be born American, to not be born Mississippian. I'm actually from the other side of the Atlantic, from even worse than New England, from Old England. And you probably are therefore wondering, who is this English guy? What is he doing running the Mississippi Center for Public Policy? And what does he think he's doing here? Well, by way of introduction, I was a Member of Parliament in Britain for 12 years. I was elected 4 times. I won re-election every time I ran. And I went into politics to achieve what today we call Brexit. I believe that what you guys figured out at Yorktown, that countries are more successful when they were self-governing, I believe my own country, Britain, should become self-governing again. It should leave the European Union and manage its own affairs. This was a very minority point of view when I was first elected. There were a total of 6 out of 650 members of Parliament in 2005, the year I got elected, who believed that Britain should leave the European Union. After achieving the win in the referendum, the initiative process, you might call it, I quit politics. I believed that I had done what I set out to achieve. I'm not one of those people who think that politicians should go into politics to find endless justification for seeking re-election. I wanted to do something, I had the great fortune to be able to achieve it, and then I quit. Now, I think it's fair to say that in this room there may be 1 or 2 people who've also had a bit of election experience in politics. Some of you may have, I don't know, helped Delbert Hoseman, who's from around here. You may have helped some of your local officials in elections. Well, you'll know what I mean when I say that in running for election all of those times that I ran for election, you get to see human nature in all its rich tapestry, if I can put it euphemistically like that. You get to see people in all their full glory. There was this one time I was campaigning during the referendum in a quite well-off neighbourhood. The houses were quite big and they had these long lawns and sweeping gravel drives. And there was this one house that was particularly grand. Think of it as a sort of slightly smaller version of Downton Abbey. And I was going door to door, knocking on doors, asking if people would be voting the right way. And I went up to this giant oak door in this big house. And I knocked on the door, and there was no response. And I rang what looked like the bell, and I could hear the bell ringing. And I noticed that this big oak door was actually slightly open, and I could hear this tinkling of music in the background. And I thought to myself, well, there's bound to be someone at home. So I kept knocking, and eventually I noticed this young face of a young boy peering round the door up at me. He must have been, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 years old. And he opened the door slightly, and I noticed he was wearing a smoking jacket, several sizes too big, with the sleeves rolled up. And then I noticed in one hand he held a balloon-shaped glass and was swirling it with a liquid that looked suspiciously like brandy. And then I noticed in his other hand, between his fat little fingers, a cigar. And I looked down at him and I said, "Young man, are your mother and father at home?" And he looked up at me and said, "Does it really look as if they're at home?" you get to see life in one tapestry. So why did I come to Mississippi? Well, Why did I come to America? If you believe as passionately as I do that freedom and liberty are the motor of human progress, they are, to use the phrase of Ronald Reagan, what has elevated our species from the swamp to the stars, then there is no country on earth that compares to this republic. None whatsoever. Americans often take America's success for granted, so hear it from me as an outsider. There is no country quite like America. Americans sometimes don't appreciate America, and often, I'm sorry to say, young Americans are often taught not to appreciate their own country. But I think there is something really extraordinary about a country that is only 5% of the world's population. The United States today is only 5% of all of humankind. And just look at what it is your country has achieved. Look at what it does. It dominates the world economy. It is surely the most inventive nation that has ever existed. It is a country that from the age of powered flight to the age of the iPhone has been at the cutting edge of almost every technological innovation. Japan managed to produce the Sony Walkman and some toy called the Tamagotchi. During that period, America has invented the digital economy and all the giants of the digital world that have become household names. Where are Europe's Googles? Where are Japan's Facebooks? America was the world that the country that pioneered the world's first vaccines against COVID. There is no country that compares to the United States. Why is this? Is it perhaps because there's the laws of physics are different in America? No, they're not. The laws of physics are the same in America as everywhere else on the planet. Is it perhaps because there's something in the water in America? Well, I can tell you, coming from Jackson, there's certainly something in the water that that's a different story. No, the real reason why your country is different is because of decisions that were made in that old courthouse in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. That is what injected liberty into the DNA of your republic. That is what sets America apart. America is not just a material achievement. You weren't just the country that put the first man on the moon or invented the iPhone. Your country is a moral achievement. Your country is a country that has used its might for the first time in human history to make the world a better place. It was America's might that saved the world from barbarism not just once, but 3 times in the past century. In the First World War, to save the world from German militarism. In the Second World War, to save the world from Nazism. And when you won the Cold War, rescuing much of the world from Soviet communism. Today it is American shoulder-held missiles, with a little help from the Brits, that is keeping the Russians at bay in Ukraine. It is the United States that has achieved all of this. 400 years ago, there was an Englishman who famously gave a sermon about the United States, and he called the American settlements, or what was to become the American settlements on what is today the northeast coast of the United States, he called America a city on a hill, or as Reagan famously called it, a shining city on a hill. What did he mean by that? When John Winthrop talked about America being a city on a hill, he talked about it as being a settlement where outsiders could look in, as though looking up the hill, into the settlement, and see America as an example of how a society might live. And I think America today is a shining example to the world of how a society might be. But I think America is also under attack. It is under attack today as never before. Now, when Ronald Reagan was in the White House, there were people who were pointing missiles and tanks at the United States, but you knew who they were, Soviet communists. They were outside the gates. When FDR was waging war against Nazism, we knew who the enemies of America were. They were pointing navies and armies in our direction. I would say that the enemy of the American ideal today is subtly different. They're sapping America's strength from within. They are not to be found outside America, but teaching young Americans a toxic, poisonous idea of what America should be from within. They're to be found promoting ideas that I think are fundamentally inconsistent with the founding principles on which America is built. They teach young Americans, for example, that America is built on hatred and racism. Now let's be clear about this. America has produced lots of laws and lots of leaders that have failed to live up to the promise of the founding. But the idea that America is built on racism and hatred is absurd. Anyone who looks at the southern border notices one thing about it: the traffic is coming one way. People are trying to get into America. People from every culture, every color, every race are trying to come to the United States to make this country their home. That is because America is the one country in the world that offers people opportunities irrespective of their background. America, we're often told, has produced some appalling leaders. People are taught to think of American leaders as the bad guys, to think of their country as always wrong. Well, let me show how absurd that idea is. I gave a talk at a university in America recently, and I identified who I thought were the three greatest American presidents in 240 years of the American Republic. I said, number one, obviously George Washington, right? He beat us guys. So he had to be pretty good, right? And he gave liberty to freedom to the Republic. And like Cincinnatus, he retired, having saved the Republic, and went back to his farm. He has to be one of the great American presidents. But if your measure of greatness is an American leader that extends liberty, I would say Abraham Lincoln was an even greater president. He extended the promise of liberty and the founding to every American, and he too saved the Republic. If liberty is your measure of the greatness of an American president, I would say the greatest of them all had to be Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan made sure that the liberties that Americans took for granted were extended to the greater part of humankind when he won the Cold War. Those are the great American presidents. Who are the bad American presidents? Think of the worst possible American president that you could think of in 240 years. Now, some of you might say, I don't know, Joe Biden. I think that would be unfair. Some of you might say Richard Nixon, perhaps. Some of you might say LBJ. I would probably agree with you. But think of the worst American president. If the worst American president you can think of is Nixon, if you think America is a bad country, compare Richard Nixon to the worst leader in 240 years produced by Russia. You don't even have to look that far. His name's Putin. He's pretty bad. You've got Stalin. He's pretty bad. Think of the worst leader that Japan has produced, or Germany, or Italy, or pretty much anywhere. For all of America's failings, America has produced some great leadership, thanks to the Constitution. America is not always the bad guy. America, I think, is almost always the good guy in world affairs. But if America loses the principles of the founding, the principles that were established in the Constitution in 1787, America is going to become just another country. It's going to lose that exceptionalism. And if America becomes just another nation, it will be bad for your nation, it will be catastrophic for every other nation, because it is your nation that has done so much to uplift the condition of all of humankind. At the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, we are driven by an absolute belief that we need to defend freedom and liberty. We believe that that is the secret of American greatness, and that is what we exist as an organization to do. We also believe, and this is why I wanted to come and work for the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, not go off to DC and work for a think tank, but to work at a state-level think tank. All the great innovations in American public policy in my lifetime, they've not come from Washington, they've not come from a president, Republican or Democrat. All the great public policy innovations in America come from the states. Charter schools. Now, I know Barack Obama used to say that they were his idea, but actually, they were started in California and the Midwest. Zero-tolerance policing. That was an innovation tried out, I think, first in Philadelphia and New York. Welfare reform. Now, Bill Clinton claimed that Wisconsin-style welfare reform was his idea, but actually, as the name suggests, it was tried out first in Wisconsin. Arizona has shown how red tape can be cut. Texas and Florida have shown what it means to get rid of taxes. I want to make sure that Mississippi makes the kind of changes that other states will copy and do things that other states will look to and emulate. And I think there are some things that we're already starting to push for. I think that one of the big failings in the state of Mississippi is the fact that the public education budget is so often used not to give young people the education they have a right to expect, but it's used almost as a pay system in the interests of those on the payroll. We produced something called the Mississippi Fat Cap Report. As the name suggests, it was a list of the 50 highest paid public officials in the state of Mississippi. You might think a list of the 50 highest paid public officials in Mississippi would include the governor. No, it didn't. He wouldn't even make the top 100. You might think it would include the Attorney General or the Lieutenant Governor. They wouldn't even make the top 150. No. The list of the 50 highest paid public officials was dominated by school superintendents, not from successful school districts, but from failing school districts. The money is being used not to improve what happens in the classroom, but to in the benefit of vested interests. We think this needs to change. Martin Luther King, a couple of generations ago, very famously talked about having a dream of America where people were judged not on the colour of their skin, but on the content of their character. I think that phrase is up there with anything that Thomas Jefferson ever said. It's as well known and as great as anything that Abraham Lincoln ever said. And it is great because it is a direct appeal to the founding promise of America. This idea that all Americans are created equal. All Americans are in possession of inalienable rights. That is the secret of America's success. This idea that everyone in this republic is an individual and can decide and be the author of their own future and destiny. That is why I think it is so invidious that young Americans are being taught the principles of so-called critical race theory. This is an attempt by people to say, don't think of yourselves as an individual American in possession of these individual rights, but define yourself according to a collective identity. It's a deeply destructive and toxic way of thinking that will corrode what it means to be American. So we drafted a bill to tackle this, which I'm delighted to see was passed by both the House and the Senate and signed into law by the governor. I think we need to recognise, though, that you don't defeat bad ideas like critical race theory by passing just legislation. You need to replace them with good ideas. You need to teach young Americans to understand and respect and admire America's past and America's founding. We have campaigned vigorously for the abolition of the state income tax. And I'm really pleased to see that on Monday, the governor signed into law the largest tax cut in Mississippi's history. The income tax is not, I'm afraid to say, going to be completely abolished. There needed to be compromise, and I understand that. But if Mississippi is to prosper, if Mississippi is no longer to be ranked 50th out of 50 states, Mississippi needs lower taxes and to become more competitive. Over the past 30 or 40 years, there has been a wave of prosperity across the southern United States. Atlanta has grown, Georgia's grown, Florida's grown, Texas has grown, Nashville is booming. Well, the one thing that Texas, Florida, and Tennessee all have in common is they don't have a state income tax. We need to get rid of our state income tax to be more competitive, and I'm really pleased that as a result of our campaign, we've taken the first step to getting rid of it. I placed on your tables a single sheet that just sums up in numbers some of our achievements as an organisation. We're a very small organisation. We have a tiny office and a small staff. But I think it highlights what it is that we do. It highlights the fact that we now have a regular weekly readership of about 80,000 people. If you haven't yet signed up to receive our weekly newsletter, please do so. Please send me an email. I would love for you to be kept informed about what it is we're doing. We produce content online that is read by about 250,000 Americans a week. When I began in this role, it was overwhelmingly Mississippians, and it still is overwhelmingly Mississippians, but I'm pleased to say that we're now putting out content that is resonating further afield than just Mississippi. When we're arguing for deregulation, for lower taxes, for action against critical race theory, we're starting, I think, to find a bigger audience. We're starting, I think, to move the dial. Finally, we're funded almost entirely by Mississippians, and there are people here in this room today whose generosity makes it possible what we do. So I thank you if you're one of those people who makes it possible for us to do what we do. We're dependent on private donations overwhelmingly from people in Mississippi. I'll conclude, if I may, I'm conscious of the time, with the one question people usually then ask me, which is, okay, so we know why you've come and what you're trying to do, but how do you find it here in Mississippi? What do you think of Mississippi? I have to tell you, I love it here. I absolutely love being in Mississippi. My family, Clementine, my wife, Kitty, my daughter, they love it here too. And I shouldn't forget Crumble the dog. She's taken a little bit of adjusting to your summer heat, but she's loving it. Now, there are still a few moments when I wonder if I've quite mastered the art of living here. I'll talk about a lift when I mean an elevator. I'll talk about rubbish when I mean garbage, or soil when I mean dirt, or water when I mean water. And sometimes, let it be said, I still drive on the left-hand side of the road. But the oncoming traffic is usually very understanding and moves out of the way. But I could not think of a better country to be in than the United States, a better state to be in than Mississippi, and a more wonderful role to be in working with the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. So thank you for inviting me. I hope that's given you a flavour of what we do, and I would love to field any questions. Thank you.